Hello everyone. Welcome to AWS training by Unogeeks. In this video, I'll give you introduction to IAM service or Identity and Access Management Service in AWS. Okay, so the IAM service basically enables you to create users and roles, and it will let you manage access to AWS services and resources securely. So what this means is, without the permissions, you will not be without the required permissions, you won't be able to access AWS services or resources. Okay, so using IAM, Identity and Access Management, this is one of the service that AWS offers. And this is the one that you basically start off with in AWS. And you use this to create AWS users and roles in AWS account. So I've shown you how to create an AWS root account or AWS free account in one of the previous videos, right? So when you sign up for AWS account, you will get a root account created. But that AWS root account should not be used to carry out a day-to-day operations. So you will log into AWS console and you will create IAM users or users using IAM service in AWS. So you can create IAM users and you could also create roles. And with the help of these users and roles, you can assign permissions to allow or deny access to AWS resources, such as the EC2 or S3. So all the AWS resources that you have, you can give explicit permissions to the users or the roles so that they will be able to so that you either you allow the access to those resources or deny the access to those resources. So you could do both. And IAM, as such, you don't need to pay anything extra to use this particular feature because all you're doing is creating users, right? But when after you create the users, you would give them access or permissions to access AWS resources and consume them, and that's when you will be charged. So for that matter, you don't have any additional charge for creating users using IAM service. But later on, when those users start using AWS services, you will be charged for that. You will be charged for usage of those additional services or the core services, I would say. And one point which I often see students getting confused at is that the students saying that when you create a user in AWS, they think that it is a user that can be used to access the applications deployed in access. Sorry, they think that it's an identity management for the applications deployed in the AWS account. Say, for example, you created a IAM user, and yeah, you assign permissions for that IAM user to be able to launch EC2 instances. EC2 stands for Elastic Compute Cloud, and with that EC2 privilege, you can launch a Windows server or a Linux server, and on top of that server, you could deploy an application. So uh, when you create a user in IAM, as that IAM user, you will be able to launch the applications. You will be able to launch the EC2 instance. You will be able to deploy the applications and run them on the EC2 instances. But what you cannot do is you cannot use that IAM user as an authentication mechanism for that application that you have deployed. Each application or an operating system that you deploy within AWS, so when you launch a Windows server, it has its own authentication mechanism. It has its own users. It will have its own admin user and a password. Or when you deploy applications on top of those operating systems, they will have their own usernames and passwords. So don't think that when you create a user in IAM, don't think that that is something that you can use as an identity management for your applications and operations. It doesn't work that way. You create users and roles in IAM to be able to control or allow or deny access to AWS resources. As simple as that. So IAM is only used to assign and grant permissions to AWS services, not to the applications or the operating systems that you deploy in maybe an EC2 instance. So please get this point right, guys, because most people get confused here, and you might probably be tested on this in the certification exam as well. And just a quick diagram to help you understand how IAM works. So you create a role, or users in IAM, Identity and Access Management Service. I'll show you how to access it in a moment. We'll get into the console, and then you authenticate yourself. So you log into the console, or you can authenticate in multiple ways. Again, you could directly sign into the console by accessing the URL. You can enter the username and password and MFA code if it is enabled. And then after that, depending on whatever privileges are assigned, or depending on whatever uh, is allowed for that particular user or role as per the access they have, they will be able to send out requests. And those requests include sending out requests to access a particular resource. And when you send out requests, again, you have an option to attach a policies. You have an option to create and attach policies. So you will create policies using a JSON format. JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation. In simpler terms, it is basically a simple JSON file wherein you mention what is it that you're trying to allow, or what permission is it that you're trying to grant to a particular resource. So you create a JSON policies. It could be the effect could be allowing access to a particular resource, or denying access to a particular resource. So it could be both. Effect could be allow or deny. So in another video, or probably in second video from now, we'll talk more about the resource policies in detail. Okay, so you log into the AWS using the username as an IAM user, and then you send out requests for AWS resources. And whether that request should go through or not, it depends on the policies that are attached to that user or an IAM role. And the policies are basically written using a JSON format. I'll show you how the JSON looks like and how you can quickly learn and start writing your own authorization formulas there. So authentication and authorization are two different things. Authentication lets you authenticate who you are to the application or to AWS. And authorization is like giving user a permission to access a certain AWS resources to either the user or to the role. Authentication means you're confirming your identity there, saying that you are so and so. And to be able to let AWS understand that you have the authorization policies attached, that happens through the authorization. So the authorization happens through the policies attached to the user. Okay, so authentication and authorization are completely two different things. Authentication lets you confirm your identity. Authorization lets you confirm that yes, you do have the policies attached to your profile, which can let you, or which authorizes you to access certain AWS resources, be it EC2 instance, or be it an S3 service. So you created a bucket in S3 service and you have uploaded files in there, and say at a later point you want to pull the files. So you will be able to either create a bucket in a S3 or pull the file from there only if you have the authorization policies attached to your profile, which will let you do it. And the good thing with authorization is AWS follows the least minimal policy. So everything will be denied unless you explicitly allow each and every access that you want to assign to a particular user. So it's like you start off with a blank slate with everything denied as a starting point, and you need to pick and choose what authorization access do you want to give to the user or a role. Okay, so be it launching EC2 servers, or starting or stopping the instances. Okay, or be it creating users in IAM itself. That again in itself is an authorization policy. Or be it S3 creating a bucket, deleting bucket, or adding files onto the bucket as well. And yes, you have resources underlying in there. And you can in these policies, again, in the effect you mention whether you want to allow access or deny access, and in the principle you mention whom do you want to give that privilege. Yeah, and you can mention the action as well, and in the action you mention, do you want to give a user a privilege to perform a specific action or all the actions. So you could create a policy which says that yeah, hello John, effect hello John, the principal is John. And action, what action do you want to assign? You can say grant full access on EC2. And what that means is he will be, then John will be able to, after you assign this policy to the John, to John user, the John will be able to do anything in EC2 service. So he can launch instances, he can start instance, stop instance, he can do whatever he want. But you can give all privileges. You can give a full access on a particular service, or you could give a specific action as well. So access to perform a specific action, or authorization to perform a specific action, such as maybe start instance, but you don't want John to be able to stop the instance. So you can, in such cases, you could restrict the access to a specific action in itself. Okay, instead of giving them a blank access to a particular AWS service. That is again possible. And one more thing that you could probably do is, if you have multiple accounts, and you would certainly have multiple accounts in an implementation project, you might have a dev account, SAT, UAT account, or you might have accounts created with a different terminology. But whatever might be the case, in case you have multiple AWS accounts, and if you want to grant access to other users, you could do that as well. So the cross account access is also possible. So it might be too technical at this point for you guys to understand, but yeah, the key takeaway from this particular slide is, you can create, using IAM, you will create users and roles. And yes, those users and roles will help you to grant access to AWS resources. So yes, the user or role will authenticate. And then after they authenticate, depending on the authorization attached to the user or a role, and it authorization is granted in the form of a policies that you attach. And policies are basically a JSON documents that you can write down. Uh, you can handcraft them, or you have a visual editor available in AWS which can help you to quickly generate it. And that's the most easiest way to generate a policy. And through that, policies is basically a permissions that you grant to the user or a role. And in that permissions, you can assign access to the services, access to individual AWS services to the user or a role. So the user will authenticate himself or herself, and then based on the authorization or permissions they have, they can access other AWS services, and yeah, do whatever they are supposed to do as part of their job. And this is how IAM works. And IAM features, yes, you have enhanced security, because IAM is, it secures, it's secure by default. Users will have no access to AWS until you explicitly grant them. So when you create an IAM user, unless you grant a specific permission to that user, he will not have, by default, he will not have he will not have access to any AWS resources. And that is the best starting point that you could have, or that you could ask for, right? So you create a user, and by default he gets access to some applications, or some services that might make it difficult for you to control. So when you create an IAM user, he will have access to nothing in AWS until you explicitly grant it. And you have a fine granular control in IAM, meaning you can control what sort of permission you want to give to a specific user or a role. Okay, so you could say that, yeah, I want to give a user only a permission to be able to terminate an EC2 instance, not create, start, or stop. Or I could also say that I could also restrict the permission to reading only to only reading the contents from S3 bucket. I don't want to let the user uh, write a file or put a file in S3, or delete a file from S3 bucket. So S3, it stands for simple storage service. It's basically, in layman terminology, you can think of it as a Google Drive. You got a storage space in AWS into which you upload the files. And before you upload the files in S3, you create a bucket, and then you put your files in the buckets. And you could grant explicit privileges to the AWS services like EC2 or S3. You could let them only read the files from S3, or terminate EC2 instances, but not launch EC2 or start or stop instances. Or in other, or in on the similar lines, you don't want to let user be able to delete files from S3 bucket. And you've also got a flexible security credential management. So you could enable MFA if you want, and you could also enable the you could sign into the AWS account using username and password. And there is also something called as access keys, which we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. So if you want to sign into AWS account from say applications or from say command line tools, you can make use of something called as access keys. So you have got a flexible security credential management available in AWS. And you could also leverage external identity systems in case you don't want to go through the process of creating users again. So if your company already has a Microsoft Active Directory or any other standards based identity providers like Facebook or Google, you could leverage them and you could use them to authenticate users and let them sign into the AWS application. So this will avoid the need to create individual IAM users. And what are the different ways to access IAM? A lot of theory so far. Let's see how you can access IAM from. So the one obvious way is to access IAM through management console. So if you log into, go to awsamazon.com, sign into the console. So one easiest way to access IAM is to log into the console and access IAM from there. You log in as a root account. And enter the password. And since I don't have MFA enabled, it directly signs me into the console. And in the security console, sorry, on the management console, under security, identity, and compliance category, you see that IAM appears there at the top. So you click on it. So this is how you access IAM. This is one way to access IAM rather, by signing into the AWS management console. And in here, yes, you have options to deal with everything that you need to do in IAM. You could create users, you could create users groups, you could create roles, you could create policies and attach there. And you could also configure the external identity providers in there. Okay, so in the next video, I'll show you how to create a user and a user group. And in a video after that, we'll see how to create role and the policies. So at the moment in this application, I've got two users. So if I click on users, I'll be able to show them to you. So I've got two IAM users created apart from the root user. So yeah, the prasad@unogeeks.com is one, and John.doe is another user. So yes, you can, if you want to create user or create role or user groups, you can perform those actions manually by logging into the management console. This is one way you access IAM. But this is not the only way. You could also perform these actions using an AWS command line tools. So we'll talk about this in a later series of videos. But yeah, you can download AWS command line tools and you can access IAM through them. And you could also use SDKs, and they will give you a programmatic access to IAM and AWS. Or you also have quite a few REST APIs exposed by AWS, which you could use to access and manage IAMs. So to create an IAM user, you could do it manually by logging into console, or you could hit an API and have the IAM user created. And you could get it done through these two options as well. Okay. And when it comes to IAM principles and identities. So how many types of users do we have, or what is it that you need to be aware of? You have a root user, which will be created when you sign up for when you sign up for AWS account first up. So that is, a root user is nothing but an enterprise user with full access on AWS account. Okay, so and this is the user with which you have created AWS account in first place. And as a best practice, you should not use a root user credentials for your daily work. That's because this enterprise user has full access on the AWS account. And that includes access to all the services available in AWS. And that includes closing the account or terminating the AWS account. So the companies can go out of business if their root user password is leaked out in case they are using it for performing day-to-day operations. So instead, what you have to do is create IAM users and use them to perform those operations on a daily basis. Okay, you have to create IAM entities, be it users or roles, to control and perform the actions within AWS. Because if you log in as a root user, see here, I've logged in as a root user here, and as a root user, I have full control on this particular on my AWS account. So if I have thousands of servers running in there, and if I have all my IT infrastructure in place, I'm looking at this from a client standpoint. And if I've been using root account to perform all these operations on a day-to-day basis, so I have all the privileges that I need. So if I go to my account and if I scroll down, I have all the options. Okay, so if I scroll down, I have options to close the account as well. So this action is undoable. Okay, so you have such repercussions of using a root account to perform day-to-day operations. So that's why it's strictly not allowed to use or it's strictly recommended not to use root user to perform day-to-day operations. And then what do you do as a workaround, or what is the ideal way of doing things? You have to create IAM entities, be it users or roles. And how do you do that? You log in as a root user first, and then you go to IAM service. How do you access it? From the console, under security, identity and compliance, you have IAM. Click on it. That will take you into IAM dashboard, and you can create users here. So you come here, add user, and then go through those 4 or 5 screens, and then have the user created. And in a similar way, you can create a role as well. So you create users and roles, and from there onwards, you will have to use you'll have to keep you will have to log in as IAM users, and not as a root user. And one more the point that you need to note here is, so if you see here, when you log into the AWS account as a root user, yes, you can do it from the AWS console directly. But when you want to sign into AWS account as an IAM user, you could use a custom URL. You need to use a custom sign-in URL. And the custom sign-in URL, yes, the URL will appear here. And by default, the URL will be in this particular format. So you could create an IAM user. And when you create a user, by default, they won't get access to anything unless you explicitly grant it. And the IAM users need to sign into the AWS account using a sign-in URL, and that URL will be in this specific format. You have AWS account dot sign in dot aws dot amazon.com slash console slash. So this will be the default sign-in URL for IAM users. So by default, you will have your account ID in the sign-in URL. But if you want to make it easy for the people, for IAM users to remember the link and quickly sign in, anyways, they bookmark it. But if you want to make this look a bit neat and clean, what you could do is you could customize the URL. You could edit it, and you could give any alias name you want. So whatever alias you give here, that will go and replace the AWS account ID. So I can say that this is my UG dev account. So I want to keep it simple, and whatever you type in as alias, that will replace the account ID. Okay, and if I delete alias, let me show you how that looks like. So this is how the sign-in URL looks like by default. You will have account ID and followed by that suffix. And if you want to make it easy, you could customize it, make it easy for users to remember. And if this is, say, a Unogeeks dev account, you say UG-dev, and you see the account ID getting replaced there. And you click on create alias. And with this URL, I can sign into a AWS account as an IAM user. Remember, this URL works only for IAM users. If you want to log into a root account, you can still use the same the aws.amazon.com URL. Okay, but as an IAM user, you can use this link to sign in. Okay, and you can also create IAM users. IAM user groups. That is nothing but a collection of IAM users, and typically you group users, or typically you group users together, and you put them into their respective groups. If, for example, you create a group such as admin, developer, or a test group, and you put those respective users into those user groups. So that way, it will be much easier for you to manage the permissions. Say, for example, you have 10 admins and say you have 100 developers. Whenever you want to give certain permissions to those users, say for example a developer, I want to give them an access to be able to launch EC2 instance. So if you don't have this user groups concept, I have to create a resource policy and I have to attach it to all the 100 users, which might be a tedious task to do, right? And 100 is a pretty less number when you think about real-time scenarios. So that's where user groups chip in, and this gives you an option to group IAM users together, and yeah, you can make a collection of IAM users and put them under a group so that you could manage the permissions effectively. And this is what we typically use in real time quite often. And how do you authenticate the users? To authenticate the users, the easiest way is the basic authentication. You log into the console, you enter the username and password, and then you sign in. That's one way. And another way to authenticate the user is by using access keys. So if you're signing in manually, basic authentication is fine. But if you want to log in, if you want to authenticate yourself from an application or from a CLI tool, command line tool, how do you do it? There is a better option to authenticate yourself. You could make use of the access keys that get generated when you create an IAM user. So what happens is from this console, you will see it in the next video. You have an option to generate or create users, right? So when you create users in one of the screens, there will be an access keys that get generated, and AWS prompts you to download those access keys. And the access keys, it's nothing but a combination of access key ID and access security key. And this is something that you can use to authenticate yourself as a specific user in the API calls. Okay, so you could use these access keys to authenticate yourself to access AWS resources when you send in those API calls, wherein you don't want to key in the username and password, because it would be ridiculous to expose the username and password there, right? So to keep your username and password safe, yes, you could make use of the access keys to make those API calls. But nevertheless, even if you use access keys, there are a couple of problems there. Yes, there is a problem that access keys could be leaked out, and there is that overhead that you have to keep rotating the keys, maybe once in a month or once in 2 months. Okay, we'll talk about the alternative available to this in the next slide. And another way to access or authenticate in IAM is use access key along with a session token. So what will happen is there is a service in AWS called security token service that can be internally leveraged to generate a security token, and you include it along with an access key ID, and you will use the combination of it to make the API calls. Okay, so you'll understand more about this as you keep using AWS resources. So the access keys, it comprises of an access key and a security and a access key ID and a security key. And this gives you basically an option to programmatically access AWS resources. Instead of keying the username and password, what you can do, you can pass in AWS or access keys as an alternative. And access keys can give you privileges. So for example, if you're programmatically trying to read a content from an S3 bucket in as part of your web app that you're running in an EC2 instance, in such case, what do? The application that is running in EC2 instance make use of these access keys to programmatically access the file or read the content from S3 bucket. Because in that case, you don't have a manual interface to type in username and password, right? So that's why. But what is the problem with using access keys? The keys need to be rotated on a regular basis. But of course, you could automate that process by writing the scripts if you want. Yeah, but it's pretty much like changing the password on a periodic basis. Like once in a while, you will be prompted to change your password, right? Be it any application you use. So you need to do something similar here as well for access keys. And this problem, you could work around this problem of rotating the keys and the risk of access keys getting leaked out by an alternative option. And what is that alternative option? That alternative option is to use roles to grant privileges to the AWS services. And how will that help? So if you create an IAM role, and IAM role, yes, you create a role, and you use it to grant privileges to AWS resources for a specified duration. And this particular word is important. So you will grant permissions or privileges to access a resource for only for a very limited amount of time that it needs. And these roles will be assumed by you can assign them to IAM users or applications that are running on in AWS, or any AWS service in itself, such as EC2. So say, for example, you want to grant EC2 service, Elastic Compute Cloud Service, to be able to read the content from S3 bucket. What you could do, you could create a role and you could grant EC2 service a permission to read the content from S3 bucket. And that is the basic requirement, right? So the applications would want to read from the files that they would need for the application to run. And whatever files you need for the applications, we typically put them in an S3 bucket. And EC2 instances where the applications are running, it could be web app or any application. So they should be able to access the content from S3. So if you use roles to assign such privileges, say, for example, EC2 to be able to read from S3 bucket, what is the advantage by using roles? You could do this in two ways. You could use access keys also to let EC2 instances access S3 bucket, or you could use roles. What is the best way? So when an application needs access to S3 bucket, yeah, access to S3 bucket is just an example, but you could replace this with any other potential use case. You can do it in two ways. You can provide the access keys. So you can provide the access keys of the user, and you can place them in the config file. So that application looks at the config file, picks up the access key from there, access key ID and security key, and then it gets access to the S3 bucket. But what is the problem with this a particular approach of using the access keys? You need to replace them. You need to rotate them on a regular basis, maybe once in a month at least. You have to rotate them. And what is another downside? There is a chance that this access key might get leaked out. And when it gets leaked out, anyone who got hold of those access keys will be able to read the content from S3 bucket, and there could be security breaches. So to work around these two options, you can create a role with those privileges, such as EC2 being able to access S3. So you create a role with those privileges with the least minimal privileges required, and then you assign that role to the application. You assign that role to the application. Application can assume that role, and when application assumes that role, so you might be wondering, then how will application get access to S3? To show you how it works, it works like this. So if you create an IAM role with the permissions, maybe to access, say it's an EC2 role. So it's a role for IAM role that grants EC2 instances ability to access S3 bucket maybe. And if you have application running in EC2 instance, they assume that role. And when they assume that role, the role, what it will do is it will use AWS a security token service. It's one of the a service that AWS offers. And the role generates a temporary credentials using STS service, and it will provide that temporary credentials to the EC2 instance. So with those temporary credentials, so yes, the temporary credentials will be provided to EC2 instances, and any application running on that EC2 instance, they can read those temporary credentials from the EC2 metadata. So from the instance, they can run the data, so they can read the credentials from there, and they can use those credentials. The application can use those credentials to access the resources such as an S3 bucket. And what is the biggest upside with this approach, or using the role instead of access key? You don't need to worry about rotating credentials, and you don't need to worry about the security breaches there, because the credentials that will be generated using AWS STS security token service, that will be valid only for a brief moment in time. So it will be valid for maybe 10 or 15 minutes or maybe 1 hour, for as long as that application needs. And after that, those credentials expire. So even if someone gets hold of them, it won't be of any use for them. So no security breach. And since they get generated automatically, and since they are temporary credentials that they get generated every time you access it, there is a very less maintenance required. You don't need to explicitly think of rotating the keys. So that is one of the biggest advantage of using IAM roles to grant applications or to grant privileges to AWS resources rather than using access keys. Okay, so yeah, it might sound too technical for you guys if you're hearing this for the first time, but if you watch this video for 2 or 3 times, yeah, it becomes pretty clear. Okay, thank you very much for watching this video, guys. In the next video, we'll see how to create IAM users. Okay, so we'll log into the console. We'll come here and create a user. I'll show you what all options you need to select, what all appropriate options you need to select, to be precise, when you create a user, and what is it that you need to be aware of. Please join me in the next video, guys. And thank you very much for watching this one. In case you're interested in AWS training offered by Unogeeks, please call us on this number or send a WhatsApp message. And if you have any questions, please drop a line on info@unogeeks.com. Thank you.